Think you understand World War II? Think you know what the greatest generation went through? Forget everything Hollywood, history class, and memorial documentaries taught you about the good war. World War II wasn't a heroic struggle between good and evil, with clear-cut victories and noble sacrifices. It was 6 years of systematic human destruction that killed 85 million people through methods so brutal they would break your mind just to hear about them. You've been fed sanitized stories about brave soldiers and resilient home fronts. The reality? World War II was industrial-scale murder, systematic starvation, biological warfare, mass rape, and human experimentation that turned entire continents into slaughterhouses, where death was so common that people stopped counting the bodies. This wasn't your grandfather's war stories or Saving Private Ryan. This was a global apocalypse where mothers ate their own children to survive, where entire cities were turned into crematoriums, where human beings were used as live test subjects for weapons, and where the line between civilization and barbarism completely disappeared. Today we're diving into the real World War II, the one where average life expectancy in some areas dropped to weeks, where diseases killed more people than bullets, where children were systematically murdered for entertainment, and where the simple act of trying to stay alive required moral choices that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. By the end of this, you'll understand why World War II veterans never talked about what they really saw, why entire generations were psychologically destroyed, and why this war represented the absolute worst of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. Welcome to your first day as a civilian during World War II. Forget everything you think you know about wartime hardship from movies or family stories. You're about to experience living conditions so horrific that simply surviving another day required luck, brutality, and moral compromises that would destroy most modern people. You wake up in 1942 Warsaw, in what's left of your apartment, after the latest bombing raid. The building next to yours is gone, just a pile of rubble with arms and legs sticking out at odd angles. The smell hits you immediately: rotting flesh, human waste, smoke from fires that never stop burning, and the sweet, sick odor of gangrene from untreated wounds. Your breakfast is a slice of bread made from sawdust, potato peels, and whatever else could be ground up to resemble food. This single slice represents your entire daily calorie ration, maybe 400 calories if you're lucky. For comparison, a sedentary adult needs about 2,000 calories per day just to survive. You're slowly starving to death, and everyone around you is doing the same. The water, when it's available, comes from wells contaminated with corpses and human waste. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery are so common that bloody diarrhea is considered normal. People are dying from diseases that had been virtually eliminated in Europe just a few years earlier. The dead are stacked like firewood in the streets because there's no fuel to burn them and no healthy people left to bury them. Your children, if they're still alive, look like walking skeletons. Their eyes are too big for their shrunken faces. Their hair is falling out from malnutrition, and their bellies are distended from eating whatever they can find: grass, tree bark, leather from shoes, sometimes human flesh when nothing else is available. Many parents are facing the choice between watching their children starve slowly or killing them quickly to end their suffering. But you're one of the lucky ones because you're not in a concentration camp, a prisoner of war camp, or living under Japanese occupation in Asia. You're experiencing what historians politely call wartime civilian hardship, the reality that affected over 500 million people during World War II. Let's talk about what winter means during World War II. It's not just cold, it's death arriving one frozen limb at a time. With no heating fuel available, indoor temperatures in many occupied cities regularly dropped below freezing. People burned furniture, books, anything combustible just to stay alive for another day. Families huddled together in single rooms, often sharing body heat with strangers because it was the only way to prevent freezing to death. Frostbite was epidemic. People lost fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs to the cold. Without proper medical care, these injuries became infected and often fatal. Gangrene was so common that the smell of rotting flesh became part of the daily atmosphere in many cities. People learned to recognize the difference between the smell of dead bodies and the smell of living people whose extremities were rotting off. The psychological impact of constant starvation changed people in ways that survivors found impossible to explain to their post-war families. Chronic hunger doesn't just make you weak, It makes you obsessed with food to the point of insanity. People thought about food constantly, dreamed about food, talked about nothing but food. They would save crumbs for days, hide tiny amounts of food from their own family members, and fight violently over scraps that wouldn't feed a modern house cat. The desperation led to behaviors that peacetime minds couldn't comprehend. Parents stole food from their own children. Children informed on their parents to authorities for extra rations. Neighbors killed each other over a single potato. The moral framework that held society together simply collapsed under the pressure of systematic starvation. Disease was the constant companion of everyone who lived through World War II. Malnutrition weakened immune systems to the point where minor infections became deadly. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza killed millions of people who would have easily survived these diseases under normal conditions. The lack of soap, clean water, and basic sanitation created perfect breeding grounds for every infectious disease known to medicine. Vermin infestations were universal. Lice, fleas, rats, and other disease-carrying creatures thrived in the unsanitary conditions that characterized wartime life. People's bodies were constantly covered with insect bites and the infections they caused. Typhus, spread by lice, killed hundreds of thousands of people who were already weakened by hunger and cold. The bombing campaigns that targeted civilian populations created a special kind of hell that went far beyond the immediate death and destruction. The psychological terror of living under constant threat of sudden death drove entire populations to the edge of madness. Children who survived the war often suffered from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, but at the time was just called being difficult or shell shock. The sound of aircraft engines would send entire cities into panic. People lived in cellars, subway tunnels, and bomb shelters for months at a time, sharing cramped spaces with hundreds of strangers under conditions that bred disease and violence. These shelters were often death traps themselves. When they took direct hits, everyone inside would be buried alive or killed by the concussion. But even when the bombs didn't fall directly on you, the bombing campaigns created long-term problems that killed people slowly. Destroyed infrastructure meant no clean water, no sewage treatment, no electricity, and no way to transport food or medical supplies. Cities that had been centers of civilization became medieval plague zones within weeks of sustained bombing. The deliberate targeting of civilian food supplies was a weapon of war that caused more suffering than many military battles. Armies would systematically destroy crops, livestock, and food storage facilities as they advanced or retreated. This scorched earth policy meant that civilian populations were left with absolutely nothing to eat, forcing them to choose between starvation and collaboration with enemy forces. Women faced additional horrors that were systematically ignored in post-war histories. Mass rape was used as a weapon of war by all armies, not just the ones that lost. Women and girls from age 8 to 80 were routinely sexually assaulted by occupying forces, often repeatedly, and often resulting in death from injuries or subsequent infections. Many women committed suicide rather than face continued sexual violence. The children who survived World War II were psychologically destroyed in ways that affected entire generations. Many had witnessed their parents killed, had been forced to kill others to survive, or had been used as weapons themselves, sent to deliver bombs or gather intelligence because adults assumed children were harmless. These child survivors grew up to become parents who had no idea how to raise children normally because they had no experience of normal childhood themselves. Medical care during World War II was primitive even by 1940s standards because most medical supplies and trained personnel were diverted to military use. Civilian hospitals, when they operated at all, had no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and often no trained doctors. Surgery was performed with kitchen knives, amputations were done with saws, and infections were treated with folk remedies that usually made things worse. Pregnancy and childbirth during the war were often death sentences for both mother and child. Malnutrition caused widespread miscarriages and birth defects. Women who did carry pregnancies to term often died in childbirth from complications that would be easily treatable today. Babies born during the war had drastically reduced chances of survival. Infant mortality rates in some areas exceeded 50%. The black market economy that developed during the war created its own forms of violence and exploitation. People were murdered for their ration cards, for small amounts of food, or for anything that could be traded for necessities. Professional criminals thrived while ordinary people were forced to become criminals themselves just to survive. Currency became worthless in many areas, and bartering systems developed where people traded personal possessions for basic necessities. Wedding rings, family heirlooms, and anything of value were exchanged for a few days' worth of food. Many people literally gave away everything they owned just to stay alive a little longer. The propaganda machines of all nations worked overtime to convince their populations that the suffering was worthwhile and that victory was inevitable. But the reality was that most civilians had no idea who was winning or losing the war, why they were fighting, or when it might end. They were simply trying to survive one more day in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Communication systems were destroyed or heavily censored, so families often had no idea if their relatives were dead or alive. Parents didn't know if their children had survived bombing raids. Children didn't know if their parents were still alive or had been killed in industrial accidents, bombing raids, or military service. This uncertainty added psychological torture to the physical suffering that everyone endured. The concept of childhood essentially disappeared during World War II. Children were forced to work in dangerous conditions, sent to fight as soldiers, used as human shields, or simply abandoned when adults could no longer care for them. Many children survived by forming gangs that operated like small armies, fighting other children for food and shelter. The elderly and disabled were often the first to die because they couldn't compete for scarce resources or contribute to the war effort. In many societies, the decision was made, sometimes officially, sometimes informally, that these populations were expendable and should be allowed to die so that younger, stronger people might survive. Religious and cultural institutions that had provided comfort and meaning for thousands of years collapsed under the pressure of total war. Churches were destroyed, religious leaders were killed or fled, and the moral frameworks that had guided human behavior for centuries were abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. Even among the winners of World War II, civilian life was a nightmare of rationing, forced labor, constant fear, and systematic lies from their own governments. American civilians faced severe rationing and the constant terror that their cities might be bombed or invaded. British civilians endured years of bombing, rationing, and the knowledge that invasion was a constant possibility. The home front production of weapons and supplies required civilian workers to labor under conditions that would be considered criminal today. People worked 12 to 16-hour days in dangerous factories with no safety equipment, often dying from industrial accidents or slowly poisoning themselves with toxic chemicals used in weapons production. The environmental damage caused by World War II created health problems that persisted for decades after the war ended. Chemical weapons, industrial pollution, and the destruction of natural systems contaminated air, water, and soil across entire continents. People who survived the war often died years later from cancers and other diseases caused by wartime environmental damage. This was the reality of civilian life during World War II, not the heroic resistance movements or brave home front workers portrayed in movies, but systematic human destruction on a scale that had never been seen before in human history. The fact that civilization survived at all is remarkable, but the cost was measured in the destroyed lives of hundreds of millions of people who experienced horrors that most of us cannot imagine. The concentration camp system during World War II wasn't just genocide, it was industrialized human destruction designed to extract maximum suffering before death, conducted with scientific precision and bureaucratic efficiency that turned murder into a routine administrative task. You arrive at Auschwitz-Birkenau after days crammed into a cattle car with 100 other people. No food, no water, no toilets, and bodies of those who died during transport still pressed against you. The smell of human waste, vomit, and death has become so overwhelming that you've stopped noticing it. Children have died in their mother's arms, elderly people have suffocated standing up because there was no room to fall down, and everyone is covered in filth and disease. The selection process begins immediately upon arrival. SS officers decide in seconds who will be worked to death slowly and who will be murdered immediately. Pregnant women, children under 14, elderly people, and anyone who looks sick are sent directly to gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. They're told they're being cleaned and deloused, but they're actually being herded to their deaths like livestock. The gas chambers themselves represent the ultimate industrialization of murder. Zyklon B pellets are dropped through roof vents into rooms packed with naked people who realize what's happening as the poison gas fills their lungs. Death isn't instantaneous. It takes 15 to 20 minutes of agony as people claw at walls, climb over each other trying to reach air that isn't poisoned, and slowly suffocate while their children die in their arms. But that's just the beginning of the systematic horror. The bodies are processed like raw materials in a factory. Gold teeth are extracted with pliers. Human hair is cut off to be used for textiles, and corpses are burned in crematoriums that operate 24 hours a day. The ash from burned humans is used as fertilizer. Nothing is wasted in this economy of death. If you're selected for work instead of immediate murder, you enter a system designed to extract every possible bit of labor from your body before you die. You're given a bowl of watery soup that might contain a few potato peels, a piece of bread that's more sawdust than grain, and sometimes a thin slice of rotten sausage. This represents about 500 to 700 calories per day, while you perform hard physical labor for 12 to 16 hours daily. The barracks where you sleep are designed for 40 people, but house 200 to 300. You sleep on wooden shelves with 8 to 10 other people, sharing a space meant for two. There are no mattresses, blankets, or pillows, just rough wooden boards and whatever rags you can find. Body heat is the only warmth, so people fight violently for positions in the middle of sleeping groups. Disease spreads like wildfire in these conditions. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and other infectious diseases kill thousands daily. The camp hospital is actually a place where inmates are sent to die or used for medical experiments. Prisoners with treatable conditions are often killed with phenol injections rather than being treated because dead prisoners require fewer resources than sick ones. The medical experiments conducted on prisoners represent some of the most horrific torture ever systematically inflicted on human beings. Prisoners are subjected to freezing experiments where they're submerged in ice water until they nearly die, then warmed up and frozen again repeatedly. Others are infected with diseases to test potential treatments, sterilized through radiation or surgery without anesthesia, or have limbs amputated to study blood loss. Dr. Joseph Mengelé's experiments on twins at Auschwitz included sewing children together to create artificial conjoined twins, injecting chemicals into children's eyes to change their color, and performing surgery on conscious patients without anesthesia. Pregnant women were cut open while alive to observe fetal development. These weren't crude torture sessions, but methodical scientific experiments conducted by trained physicians. The work assignments in concentration camps were designed to kill prisoners through exhaustion and industrial accidents. Inmates were forced to build the very camps where they were imprisoned, construct weapons for the German war effort, and work in chemical plants that slowly poisoned them. Many prisoners were literally worked to death in quarries, mines, and construction sites where human life was cheaper than machinery. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical abuse. Prisoners were forced to participate in their own destruction. Jewish prisoners were made to operate gas chambers and crematoriums, knowing they were processing the bodies of their own family members. This participation was designed to break prisoners psychologically and make them complicit in the murder system. Punishment in concentration camps was designed to terrorize all prisoners while slowly killing the specific victims. Common punishments included hanging by the wrists for hours or days, being locked in standing cells too small to sit or lie down, being forced to stand at attention outdoors in all weather for entire days, and being beaten with wooden clubs until bones broke. The sport sessions conducted by guards involved forcing prisoners to perform exercises until they collapsed, then beating them while they were down. Prisoners were made to run in circles for hours while carrying heavy rocks, crawl through mud on their bellies, or hop like frogs until they could no longer move. Guards bet on how long prisoners would last before dying from exhaustion. Sexual violence was routine and systematic. Women prisoners were raped by guards, forced into prostitution for camp officials, and subjected to gynecological experiments without anesthesia. Pregnant prisoners were often used for medical experiments specifically because of their condition, then killed along with their fetuses. Children in concentration camps faced specialized horrors designed to break them psychologically before killing them. They were separated from parents immediately, used for medical experiments because their bodies were thought to provide cleaner test results and often killed in front of their parents as psychological torture for the adults. The camp system included specialized facilities for different types of murder. Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec were pure extermination camps designed only to kill people as efficiently as possible. These camps could murder up to 20,000 people per day and were designed like assembly lines for death, with each step optimized for maximum killing efficiency. The prisoner hierarchy within camps created additional layers of suffering as inmates were forced to brutalize each other to survive. Prisoner guards called capos were given slightly better food and housing in exchange for beating and killing other prisoners. This system ensured that prisoners spent as much energy fighting each other as they did trying to resist their captors. The dehumanization process began immediately with the removal of names and assignment of numbers. Prisoners were stripped naked, shaved completely, and tattooed with identification numbers. They were given uniforms designed to humiliate, striped pajamas that made them look like cartoon prisoners, shoes that didn't fit, and caps that had to be removed in elaborate ceremonies whenever guards appeared. The camp economic system was designed to profit from every aspect of human destruction. Prisoner labor was rented to German companies who paid the SS for workers who were slowly dying. Personal possessions stolen from murdered prisoners were sorted and shipped back to Germany. Even the process of dying was monetized through the sale of human hair, gold teeth, and other body parts. Liberation of concentration camps didn't mean immediate relief for survivors. Allied soldiers found camps filled with dying prisoners who were too weak to move, too sick to eat normal food, and too psychologically damaged to comprehend that they were free. Many survivors died in the weeks after liberation because their bodies couldn't handle suddenly receiving adequate food and medical care. The long-term effects on survivors included severe PTSD, survivor guilt, chronic health problems from malnutrition and abuse, and inability to form normal relationships. Many survivors never spoke about their experiences because no one who hadn't lived through the camps could understand the reality of systematic human destruction. The perpetrators of this system weren't sadistic monsters, but ordinary people who had been trained to view certain populations as subhuman and expendable. Camp guards, administrators, and even the architects who designed the gas chambers were normal people who became systematic killers through gradual indoctrination and bureaucratic processes that made murder seem like ordinary work. The efficiency of the killing system was its most terrifying aspect. The Nazis had turned genocide into an industrial process with supply chains, production quotas, and quality control measures. They calculated the most cost-effective methods for murdering large numbers of people and implemented these methods with the same precision used for manufacturing consumer goods. The concentration camp system represented the logical endpoint of viewing human beings as economic units rather than individuals with inherent worth. When certain populations were classified as burdens on society rather than contributors, the step from marginalization to systematic murder became a matter of bureaucratic efficiency rather than moral consideration. Understanding the reality of concentration camps means recognizing that they weren't aberrations or the result of individual evil, but systematic programs implemented by modern, educated societies that had convinced themselves that mass murder was scientifically justified and economically necessary. The true horror of the concentration camp system wasn't just the number of people killed, but the methodical way that modern civilization and scientific knowledge were used to optimize human suffering and death. This represents perhaps the clearest example in human history of how technological advancement and social organization can be used for ultimate evil rather than human benefit. The Pacific Theater during World War II wasn't just a different war from the European conflict. It was a completely different kind of hell where the rules of civilization were abandoned entirely, creating conditions of systematic brutality that killed millions through methods so savage they defy modern comprehension. Welcome to Japanese-occupied Manila in 1944. You're a Filipino civilian watching your city being systematically destroyed not by bombing, but by deliberate massacre as Japanese forces implement their plan to kill every person in the city before retreating. This isn't military strategy. It's genocide conducted house by house, family by family, with Japanese soldiers using bayonets, swords, and fire to murder over 100,000 civilians in a matter of weeks. The Japanese military philosophy of death before dishonor created a culture where surrendering was considered worse than dying, which meant that both Japanese forces and their enemies fought with a ferocity that eliminated any possibility of mercy or humanitarian treatment. But this philosophy extended far beyond military combat into the systematic brutalization of civilian populations across Asia. The rape of Nanking in 1937 to 1938 established the pattern for Japanese treatment of conquered populations. Over the course of 6 weeks, Japanese forces systematically murdered between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war through methods designed to maximize suffering and terror. Women and girls from age 8 to 80 were raped repeatedly, often in front of their families, then murdered. Children were bayoneted for sport, buried alive, or used for target practice. But Nanking was just the beginning. The Japanese military implemented systematic policies of terror across their occupied territories that included biological warfare, human experimentation, mass sexual slavery, and industrial-scale torture that continued for 8 years. Unit 731, the Japanese Biological Warfare Division, conducted experiments on living humans that exceeded even Nazi medical experiments in their systematic cruelty. In Unit 731's facilities in occupied Manchuria, prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other diseases to study their effects on human beings. Prisoners were vivisected while still alive and conscious to observe how diseases affected internal organs. Women were raped and infected with syphilis to study the disease's progression. Prisoners were frozen alive to study frostbite, subjected to extreme pressure to study decompression, and had limbs amputated to study blood loss. The biological weapons developed by Unit 731 were used against Chinese civilian populations, with plague-infected fleas being dropped on cities and disease agents being introduced into water supplies. Conservative estimates suggest that over 580,000 Chinese civilians died from biological weapons attacks that violated every international law of warfare. Japanese prisoner of war camps represented systematic programs designed to work Allied prisoners to death while extracting maximum labor value from their dying bodies. The Bataan Death March forced 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners to walk 65 miles without food, water, or medical care in tropical heat. Those who collapsed were bayoneted, shot, or beheaded on the spot. Thousands died during the march itself, and survivors arrived at camps that were designed to continue the killing process through starvation and disease. In Japanese POW camps, prisoners received about 600 calories per day while performing hard labor for 12 to 16 hours daily. For comparison, this is less food than the minimum required to keep a human being alive without any physical activity. Prisoners were systematically starved to death while being forced to build military infrastructure for their captors. Medical care in Japanese POW camps consisted primarily of using prisoners for medical experiments or simply allowing them to die from treatable conditions. Prisoners with dysentery were denied medical treatment and forced to continue working while defecating blood. Those with malaria were used as breeding grounds for mosquitoes to spread the disease. Infected wounds were left untreated until gangrene set in, then limbs were amputated without anesthesia. The mortality rate in Japanese POW camps was approximately 27% for Allied prisoners, compared to 4% in German POW camps. This wasn't due to resource shortages, but to deliberate policies designed to kill prisoners through systematic abuse. Guards were specifically trained to view prisoners as subhuman beings who deserved to suffer before dying. Sexual slavery was institutionalized throughout the Japanese Empire through the comfort women system that forced between 200,000 and 400,000 women and girls into prostitution for Japanese military personnel. These women were kidnapped, deceived with promises of employment, or sold by desperate families, then forced to service 20 to 40 soldiers per day in conditions that amounted to systematic rape and torture. Comfort women were kept in brothels that were essentially prisons where escape was impossible and resistance was punished with torture or death. Many died from sexually transmitted diseases, physical abuse, or suicide. Those who survived were often murdered when Japanese forces retreated to prevent them from testifying about their treatment. The jungle warfare in the Pacific created unique forms of suffering that drove both sides to the edge of madness. Soldiers fought in tropical conditions where the environment itself was trying to kill them through disease, poisonous animals, plants that caused chemical burns, and humidity that rotted equipment and caused infections and minor wounds. Tropical diseases killed more soldiers in the Pacific than enemy action. Malaria was endemic, with some units experiencing 100% infection rates. Dengue fever, dysentery, typhus, and dozens of other diseases weakened soldiers until they could barely function. Fungal infections rotted feet and hands. Parasitic worms burrowed through skin and organs. The simple act of breathing could introduce deadly pathogens into lungs. The psychological impact of Pacific warfare was compounded by the Japanese practice of using suicide attacks not just in the air with kamikaze pilots, but on the ground with soldiers who would pretend to surrender, then detonate explosives or charge Allied positions while screaming and continuing to fight even after receiving fatal wounds. The island hopping campaign required Allied forces to assault heavily fortified positions where Japanese defenders had prepared to fight to the death in underground bunkers and cave systems. These battles were essentially underground sieges where soldiers fought hand-to-hand combat in tunnels, using flamethrowers to burn out defenders, and sealing caves with explosives while defenders were still inside. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated the ultimate extremes of Pacific warfare. Japanese military leaders convinced civilian populations that they would be tortured and killed if captured by Allied forces, leading to mass civilian suicides where entire families killed themselves rather than surrender. Parents murdered their own children, then killed themselves, believing they were protecting their families from worse fates. Kamikaze attacks represented the systematic weaponization of suicide on an industrial scale. Young Japanese pilots were trained specifically to die while killing as many enemies as possible, with their deaths being celebrated as the highest form of patriotic service. These weren't desperate last-ditch attacks, but carefully planned operations where death was the intended outcome for the attackers. The firebombing of Japanese cities created firestorms that killed more people in single nights than the atomic bombs that ended the war. The March 9th to 10th, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo killed approximately 100,000 people in one night and left over 1 million homeless. The fires were so intense that water in canals boiled, metal melted, and people were incinerated while running from the flames. But the firebombing wasn't just about destroying infrastructure. It was deliberate terror bombing designed to break Japanese civilian morale by making survival impossible for non-combatants. American bomber crews were specifically targeting working-class residential areas where civilians lived in wooden houses that would burn easily. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced a new form of mass killing that combined instant vaporization with slow death from radiation sickness. People near ground zero were literally vaporized, leaving only shadows burned into concrete. Others died slowly over weeks or months as radiation destroyed their cellular structure from the inside. Survivors of the atomic bombings suffered from radiation-induced cancers for decades, birth defects in their children, and social discrimination from other Japanese who feared that radiation exposure was contagious. The bombings created not just immediate mass death, but generational suffering that continued long after the war ended. The forced labor programs implemented by Japan across their occupied territories enslaved millions of people who were worked to death in mines, factories, and construction projects. Korean, Chinese, and Southeast Asian civilians were kidnapped and forced to work in conditions that killed most of them within months. These weren't prisoners of war, but civilian slaves who were treated as expendable resources. The construction of the Thai-Burma Railway by Allied POWs and Asian forced laborers killed approximately 90,000 workers out of 250,000 who were forced to work on the project. Workers died from starvation, disease, exhaustion, and execution, at rates that made the railway construction essentially a death camp that happened to produce transportation infrastructure. Cannibalism became common among Japanese forces isolated on Pacific islands, but this went beyond survival cannibalism to include the systematic killing and eating of Allied prisoners and civilian captives. Japanese officers organized formal dinners where captured Allied airmen were killed, cooked, and consumed as a form of revenge against Allied bombing campaigns. The Japanese military justice system was designed to encourage brutality rather than prevent it. Soldiers who showed mercy to prisoners or civilians were court-martialed and executed for cowardice. Military personnel were trained to view all non-Japanese people as subhuman beings whose lives had no value beyond their utility to the Japanese Empire. The environmental destruction caused by Pacific warfare included the deliberate poisoning of water supplies, destruction of agricultural systems, and introduction of diseases that continued killing people long after military operations ended. Islands that had supported indigenous populations for thousands of years became uninhabitable wastelands. The cultural destruction was equally systematic. Japanese occupation forces deliberately targeted schools, libraries, religious sites, and cultural institutions to eliminate local identities and replace them with Japanese imperial ideology. Languages were banned, cultural practices were criminalized, and children were forced into Japanese indoctrination programs. The scale of civilian casualties in the Pacific Theater exceeded military casualties by enormous margins. Estimates suggest that between 15 to 20 million civilians died in Asia during the Pacific War, compared to approximately 4 million military personnel. This wasn't collateral damage, but systematic targeting of non-combatant populations. The aftermath of Pacific warfare left entire regions psychologically and culturally traumatized in ways that affected multiple generations. Survivors suffered from severe PTSD, survivor guilt, and physical disabilities from torture and malnutrition. Families were destroyed, communities were eliminated, and traditional ways of life were completely disrupted. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal after the war prosecuted only a small fraction of those responsible for Pacific War atrocities, partly because the scale of systematic brutality was so vast that comprehensive prosecution would have required decades, and partly because the Cold War made former enemies into allies against new threats. Understanding the Pacific Theater means recognizing that it represented warfare conducted without any restraints from international law, humanitarian consideration, or basic human decency. It was systematic dehumanization and extermination conducted by modern nation-states using industrial technology and bureaucratic organization to optimize human suffering and death across an entire region of the world. The Eastern Front during World War II wasn't just the largest military conflict in human history. It was systematic human annihilation on a scale that consumed 27 million Soviet lives and turned entire regions of Europe into landscapes of death where survival required choosing between different forms of horror. You're a Soviet soldier at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, where life expectancy for new arrivals is measured in hours rather than days. The city has been bombed into rubble, but fighting continues in the ruins where soldiers battle room by room, floor by floor, sometimes killing each other with shovels and bare hands because ammunition has run out. Bodies are everywhere, piled in stairwells, frozen in positions where they died, used as cover for living soldiers who might join them within minutes. The winter fighting on the Eastern Front created conditions that challenged the basic limits of human survival. Soldiers fought in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit while wearing inadequate clothing and eating frozen rations that had to be thawed with body heat. Weapons froze and became useless. Medical supplies turned to ice. Wounded soldiers froze to death before they could be treated, often while still conscious and aware of their dying. Frostbite was so common that entire military units became combat ineffective as soldiers lost fingers, toes, hands, and feet to the cold. Gangrene from frostbite created infections that killed soldiers who had survived bullets and shrapnel. Many soldiers were found frozen to death in fighting positions, having died while still trying to fire weapons that no longer worked. But the cold was just one aspect of the environmental horror that defined the Eastern Front. The spring thaw turned the battlefield into an ocean of mud, mixed with corpses, human waste, and decomposing organic matter. Soldiers marched through knee-deep slurry that contained the remains of their dead comrades. Disease spread rapidly through armies that couldn't maintain basic sanitation while fighting continuously for months at a time. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days and killed over 1 million civilians through systematic starvation that reduced human beings to eating leather, wallpaper paste, and eventually each other. The daily bread ration dropped to 125 grams per person, a slice of bread the size of a deck of cards made mostly from sawdust and other non-food materials. People ate pet animals first, then zoo animals, then began eating human corpses. Cannibalism during the Leningrad siege wasn't rare or hidden. It became so common that authorities established special police units to arrest people for eating human flesh. Markets developed where human meat was sold alongside whatever other food could be found. Parents fed their children human flesh without telling them what it was, hoping to keep them alive one more day. The psychological impact of systematic starvation transformed people in ways that survivors found impossible to explain to others. Chronic hunger caused hallucinations, violent mood swings, and obsessive behavior focused entirely on finding food. People became capable of killing family members for a crust of bread. Moral systems that had guided human behavior for thousands of years simply collapsed under the pressure of biological survival. Soviet military tactics on the Eastern Front treated human life as the most expendable resource available. The doctrine of human wave attacks sent soldiers forward in masses designed to overwhelm German positions through sheer numbers, regardless of casualties. Soldiers were often sent into battle without weapons, expected to pick up guns from dead comrades in front of them. Order 227, known as Not One Step Back, made retreat punishable by death and established blocking units behind Soviet lines whose job was to shoot their own soldiers if they tried to withdraw from hopeless positions. Soviet soldiers faced machine guns behind them and artillery in front of them, with death being the certain outcome regardless of which direction they moved. The penal battalions on the Eastern Front were used as human mine detectors and assault troops for the most dangerous missions. These units were composed of soldiers who had been convicted of military crimes, cowardice, or political offenses, and they were sent on missions designed to have 100% casualty rates. They cleared minefields by walking through them, tested enemy defenses by attacking them without support, and were used as human shields for regular troops. Soviet prisoners of war captured by German forces faced systematic extermination through starvation, exposure, and murder. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured during the war, at least 3.3 million died in German custody. This wasn't due to resource shortages, but to deliberate policies that classified Soviet prisoners as subhuman beings who didn't deserve the protections of international law. German POW camps for Soviet prisoners were open-air enclosures with no shelter, no sanitation, and minimal food. Prisoners died by the thousands daily from exposure, disease, and starvation. Guards shot prisoners for entertainment, used them for target practice, and conducted medical experiments on them. The mortality rate in these camps often exceeded 50% within the first few months of captivity. The partisan warfare that developed behind German lines created a cycle of atrocity and counter-atrocity that consumed entire civilian populations. German forces implemented collective punishment policies where entire villages would be burned and all inhabitants killed in response to partisan attacks. These reprisal killings often targeted communities that had no connection to partisan activities. Soviet partisans, operating in occupied territory, faced impossible choices between resistance and protecting civilian populations. Partisan activities inevitably led to brutal German reprisals against civilians, but passive acceptance of occupation meant systematic exploitation and eventual extermination of Slavic populations under German racial policies. The German Hunger Plan was designed to systematically starve 30 million Slavic civilians to death to make room for German colonization. This wasn't a wartime expedient, but a deliberate policy of genocide through engineered famine. German forces systematically destroyed agricultural infrastructure, confiscated food supplies, and prevented civilian populations from accessing basic nutrition. Children on the Eastern Front faced specialized horrors designed to break family structures and eliminate future generations of undesirable populations. German forces regularly separated children from parents, used children as forced laborers, and conducted medical experiments on them. Many children were simply killed outright as part of racial cleansing operations. The evacuation of Soviet children to safer areas often became death marches, where children died from starvation, exposure, and disease, while being moved away from advancing German forces. Orphaned children formed gangs that survived through theft, violence, and sometimes cannibalism, creating generations of psychologically damaged survivors. Soviet women faced unique horrors, including systematic rape by occupying forces, forced labor in terrible conditions, and the burden of maintaining families and communities while men were fighting or dead. Women were conscripted for combat roles in unprecedented numbers, often serving as snipers, pilots, and tank crews in units with casualty rates exceeding 90%. The medical care available on the Eastern Front was so primitive that soldiers often died from wounds that would be easily treatable today. Amputation was performed without anesthesia, using unsterilized instruments. Infections were treated with improvised remedies that usually made conditions worse. Many soldiers died slowly from infected wounds that festered for weeks before finally killing them. Mental health casualties on the Eastern Front were enormous, but largely ignored because psychological breakdown was considered cowardice and punished accordingly. Soldiers who showed signs of what we would now recognize as PTSD were often shot for desertion. The psychological trauma of constant combat, witnessing atrocities, and participating in systematic killing created lasting mental damage that affected millions of survivors. The environmental destruction caused by Eastern Front warfare was so extensive that it created ecological disasters lasting decades. Forests were destroyed by artillery and deliberate burning. Agricultural land was poisoned by chemicals and contaminated with human remains. Water supplies were polluted with corpses and industrial waste from weapons production. The battle for individual cities often lasted months and reduced urban areas to rubble, where soldiers fought in sewers, subway tunnels, and the basements of destroyed buildings. Stalingrad was fought building by building, room by room, with combat so close that soldiers could hear their enemies breathing through thin walls before killing them. Artillery bombardments on the Eastern Front were so intense that they literally changed the geography of battlefields. The ground was churned into moonscape craters filled with mud, blood, and body parts. Some areas received continuous shelling for weeks, with explosions so constant that the noise became a permanent feature of the environment. The logistics of supplying armies on the Eastern Front created additional suffering for civilian populations who were forced to provide food, shelter, and transportation for military forces. Civilians were often killed when they couldn't provide supplies that didn't exist, or when military commanders decided that civilian resources were needed for military operations. Disease epidemics swept through military and civilian populations on the Eastern Front, killing millions of people who might have survived the actual fighting. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other diseases thrived in the unsanitary conditions created by continuous warfare. Medical infrastructure that had taken decades to build was destroyed within weeks of fighting. The industrial warfare on the Eastern Front consumed resources at rates that required entire populations to be mobilized for war production. Civilians, including children, were forced to work in weapons factories under conditions that killed thousands through industrial accidents, poisoning, and exhaustion. The line between military and civilian targets disappeared as entire societies were militarized. War crimes on the Eastern Front were systematic rather than exceptional, committed by all sides as deliberate policy rather than individual aberrations. Mass executions, torture, rape, and deliberate targeting of civilians became routine aspects of military operations designed to terrorize enemy populations into submission. The scorched earth tactics employed by both sides as they advanced and retreated deliberately destroyed anything that could be useful to enemy forces. This included not just military targets, but civilian infrastructure, food supplies, housing, and transportation systems. Entire regions were systematically rendered uninhabitable as military strategy. The scale of destruction on the Eastern Front was so vast that accurate casualty counts remain impossible decades after the war ended. Conservative estimates suggest that over 40 million people died in the Eastern Front conflict, including military personnel and civilians. Some areas lost 25% or more of their total population during the war years. Recovery from Eastern Front warfare took decades and required massive international assistance. Entire cities had to be rebuilt from scratch. Agricultural systems had to be reconstructed. Transportation networks had to be completely recreated. The psychological and cultural damage took generations to heal, and some communities never fully recovered their pre-war population levels. The Eastern Front demonstrated that modern industrial warfare could create conditions of human suffering that exceeded anything previously experienced in history. The combination of ideological extremism, technological capability, and bureaucratic organization produced systematic destruction that consumed entire regions and eliminated millions of people with mechanized efficiency. Understanding the Eastern Front means recognizing that it represented warfare conducted without any limits from humanitarian consideration, international law, or basic human decency. It was systematic extermination and destruction conducted by modern nation-states, using all available resources to optimize human suffering and death across a continent-sized battlefield that lasted for 4 years. The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II weren't military operations targeting enemy forces. They were systematic terror attacks designed to break civilian morale by making survival impossible for non-combatant populations, creating firestorms that turned entire cities into crematoriums where hundreds of thousands of people were burned alive. You're in Dresden on the night of February 13th to 14th, 1945, when Allied bombers drop incendiary bombs designed specifically to create an unstoppable firestorm in a city packed with refugees, fleeing the advancing Soviet army. The bombing isn't aimed at military targets, but at the historic city center, where civilians are sheltering in buildings that become death traps when the firestorm reaches temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The physics of firebombing were calculated to maximize civilian casualties. First, high explosive bombs would blow out windows and damage roofs, allowing oxygen to flow through buildings. Then, incendiary bombs would ignite fires that would grow and merge until they created self-sustaining firestorms that consumed all available oxygen while reaching temperatures that melted human bodies into unrecognizable puddles. People caught in firestorms didn't just burn to death. They were suffocated as the fires consumed all available oxygen, cooked alive as air temperatures reached levels that boiled blood, or literally vaporized when they came into direct contact with flames hot enough to melt steel. Survivors described finding human remains that had been reduced to shadows burned into pavement. The targeting of working-class residential areas was deliberate policy designed to kill the maximum number of civilians while destroying their homes and possessions. Military planners specifically avoided industrial targets that could be rebuilt and instead focused on densely populated neighborhoods where families lived in wooden or half-timbered houses that would burn easily and completely. Children were primary targets of strategic bombing because killing them would eliminate future generations of enemy populations while creating maximum psychological trauma for surviving adults. Schools, hospitals, and orphanages were bombed during daylight hours when they would be full of children. The sight of children's bodies scattered among burning rubble was intended to break adult will to continue resistance. The London Blitz demonstrated how bombing campaigns created cascading disasters that killed people in ways beyond the immediate explosive and fire damage. Bomb shelters became death traps when they took direct hits or when fires above ground consumed oxygen that people needed to breathe underground. Some shelters became mass graves when their exits were blocked by debris from bombing. Underground subway stations used as bomb shelters became breeding grounds for disease as thousands of people were packed into spaces with no sanitation, inadequate ventilation, and no privacy. Dysentery, typhoid, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through shelter populations. Many people died from preventable diseases because they were hiding from bombs in conditions that guaranteed illness. The psychological warfare aspect of strategic bombing was as important as the physical destruction. The constant threat of sudden death from above created chronic stress disorders that affected entire populations. Children who lived through bombing campaigns often suffered permanent psychological damage that manifested as anxiety, depression, and inability to form normal relationships. Air raid sirens became instruments of torture that could trigger panic attacks in entire populations. The sound of aircraft engines would send millions of people into underground shelters where they would wait for hours, not knowing if they would emerge to find their homes and families destroyed. This psychological torture continued for months or years in heavily bombed areas. The bombing of Hamburg in 1943 created the first deliberately engineered firestorm that killed over 40,000 civilians in a single week. The firestorm was so intense that it created its own weather system, with winds reaching hurricane force as air was sucked into the fire zone. People were literally blown into the flames by winds created by the bombing. Survivors of Hamburg described melted asphalt that trapped people like quicksand while they burned alive, phosphorus bombs that stuck to human skin and continued burning until it consumed all available tissue, and air so hot that people's lungs were seared when they tried to breathe. Many people survived the initial bombing, only to suffocate in underground shelters as fires above consumed all available oxygen. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented the ultimate development of strategic bombing technology. Single weapons that could destroy entire cities while killing people through methods that exceeded anything previously possible in warfare. The immediate deaths from vaporization and thermal burns were followed by weeks or months of slow death from radiation sickness. Radiation sickness caused people to die slowly as their cellular structure was destroyed from the inside. Victims suffered from nausea, diarrhea, hair loss, bleeding from all body openings, and gradual organ failure over periods that could last months. Many people who survived the initial bombing died weeks later as radiation damage caused their bodies to literally fall apart. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed more people in a single night than either atomic bomb, demonstrating that conventional weapons could create mass destruction equivalent to nuclear weapons when used systematically against civilian populations. The firestorm in Tokyo was so intense that water in canals boiled and metal structures melted. Civilians caught in the Tokyo firebombing faced choices between different methods of death: burning alive in buildings, suffocating in underground shelters, or trying to escape through streets where the asphalt was melting and the air was too hot to breathe. Many people died when they jumped into canals to escape the fire, only to be boiled alive as the water temperature rose beyond human tolerance. The resistance movements that developed in occupied territories during World War II operated under conditions that required constant choices between saving individual lives and achieving military objectives. Resistance fighters knew that any attack on occupying forces would result in brutal reprisals against civilian populations, but passive acceptance of occupation meant slow death through systematic exploitation. French resistance operations consistently resulted in German reprisals that killed 10 to 50 civilians for every German soldier killed by resistance fighters. These reprisals were designed to turn civilian populations against resistance movements by making resistance activities too costly in civilian lives. Resistance fighters had to live with the knowledge that their actions would result in the torture and execution of innocent people. Underground resistance movements faced constant infiltration by double agents, collaborators, and people who had been turned through torture. The paranoia necessary for survival meant that resistance fighters often had to kill people they suspected of betrayal, sometimes including former friends and family members who might have been forced to cooperate with occupying forces. Torture was systematically used against captured resistance fighters to extract information about other resistance members, safe houses, and planned operations. The torture techniques used by German, Japanese, and other occupation forces were designed to cause maximum pain while keeping victims conscious long enough to provide useful intelligence before they died. Women in resistance movements faced additional horrors, including systematic rape, torture designed specifically for female anatomy, and the threat that their children would be tortured in front of them to force cooperation. Many women resistance fighters were forced to watch their children being killed as punishment for their resistance activities. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising demonstrated the ultimate futility and heroism of resistance under impossible conditions. Jewish fighters armed with improvised weapons held off German forces for weeks, knowing that they had no hope of victory and that their resistance would result in the complete destruction of the remaining ghetto population. They chose to die fighting rather than be systematically murdered in extermination camps. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 resulted in the systematic destruction of the city and the death of over 200,000 civilians as German forces implemented their plan to eliminate Warsaw entirely in retaliation for the uprising. Civilians were used as human shields, executed in mass shootings, and buried alive in the rubble of destroyed buildings. Yugoslav partisan warfare created cycles of atrocity and counter-atrocity that consumed entire ethnic communities. Different resistance groups fought each other as much as they fought occupying forces, leading to ethnic cleansing operations that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians who were targeted based on their religious or ethnic identity rather than their political activities. The Soviet partisan movement behind German lines operated under orders to make occupied territory uninhabitable for German forces, which meant destroying civilian infrastructure and resources that local populations needed to survive. Partisan operations often resulted in the death of more civilians than enemy soldiers, as German reprisals targeted entire communities suspected of supporting partisan activities. Collaboration with occupying forces became a survival strategy for many civilians who faced choices between cooperation and death. But collaborators lived under constant threat from resistance movements that considered cooperation with occupying forces to be treason punishable by death. Many collaborators were killed by resistance fighters, often in front of their families as warnings to others. The moral complexity of occupied territories meant that people were forced to make impossible choices between different forms of evil. Parents might have to choose between watching their children starve or allowing them to be taken for forced labor. Community leaders might have to choose between collaborating with occupying forces or watching their entire communities be destroyed in reprisals. Intelligence gathering by resistance movements required torture and murder of suspected enemy agents, informers, and collaborators. Resistance fighters often became indistinguishable from the occupying forces they opposed, using the same methods of intimidation, torture, and murder to achieve their objectives. The Spanish Civil War, which preceded World War II but established many of its patterns, demonstrated how modern warfare could consume entire civilian populations through systematic targeting of non-combatants. The bombing of Guernica in 1937 was specifically designed to test the effectiveness of terror bombing against civilian morale. Underground printing and communication networks that spread anti-occupation propaganda operated under conditions where discovery meant torture and death for everyone involved. Resistance publications were often written with the blood of tortured resistance fighters, and distributing them required accepting that capture would result in prolonged torture before execution. Safe houses and escape networks for Allied airmen, Jewish refugees, and other targeted populations required entire communities to risk collective punishment for protecting individuals. Discovery of these networks often resulted in the execution of everyone who had provided assistance, including children who had served as messengers or lookouts. The economic resistance movements that developed in occupied territories included sabotage of industrial facilities, transportation networks, and agricultural systems. But this sabotage often resulted in hardship for civilian populations who depended on these systems for basic survival, creating conflicts between military objectives and humanitarian concerns. Medical personnel in occupied territories faced impossible choices between treating enemy wounded and risking execution for providing aid to resistance fighters. Many doctors and nurses were killed for providing medical care to wounded resistance fighters, while others were forced to treat occupying forces while watching resistance fighters die from lack of medical attention. Religious institutions that provided sanctuary for targeted populations or supported resistance activities faced systematic destruction and the execution of clergy members. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples were bombed, burned, or converted to other uses as occupying forces attempted to eliminate sources of moral authority that might support resistance. The long-term psychological impact of resistance activities affected not just the resistance fighters themselves, but entire communities that lived under constant threat of reprisals. Children who grew up during resistance periods often suffered from severe anxiety disorders, depression, and inability to trust authority figures of any kind. Recovery from bombing and resistance warfare required decades of reconstruction that went far beyond rebuilding physical infrastructure. Communities had to rebuild social trust, moral frameworks, and cultural institutions that had been destroyed along with the buildings and transportation networks. Many communities never fully recovered their pre-war social cohesion and cultural identity. Understanding the reality of strategic bombing and resistance warfare means recognizing that World War II transformed entire continents into battlefields where no distinction existed between military and civilian targets. Modern technological capability combined with ideological extremism created conditions where systematic terror became routine military strategy implemented by all major powers involved in the conflict. The end of World War II didn't bring peace. It unleashed a tsunami of human suffering that continued for decades as 85 million dead left behind broken families, destroyed societies, and psychological trauma so severe that it shaped entire generations who never spoke about what they had witnessed, because no one who hadn't lived through it could understand the reality of systematic human destruction. The displaced persons crisis after World War II created the largest refugee population in human history. Over 40 million people who had been torn from their homes by war and could never return because their communities, countries, and often their entire ethnic groups had been destroyed. These weren't temporary refugees waiting for conflict to end, but permanent exiles whose homelands no longer existed. Liberation from concentration camps didn't mean freedom for survivors who were too physically and psychologically damaged to resume normal lives. Many survivors weighed less than 80 pounds, suffered from diseases that would kill them slowly over months or years, and had been so psychologically broken by systematic dehumanization that they could no longer function in normal society. Allied soldiers who liberated the camps were traumatized by what they found. Warehouses full of human hair, rooms stacked with children's shoes, mass graves containing thousands of corpses, and survivors who were so emaciated they looked like living skeletons. Many liberating soldiers suffered psychological breakdowns that required hospitalization, and some committed suicide rather than live with the memories of what they had seen. The repatriation of prisoners of war became another form of systematic killing, as Soviet authorities executed or sent to gulags millions of Soviet soldiers who had been captured by German forces, considering them traitors for surrendering rather than fighting to the death. Families who welcomed home POWs often found themselves arrested and deported to prison camps for harboring enemies of the state. German prisoners of war held by Soviet forces faced systematic revenge as they were worked to death in labor camps, starved as retribution for German war crimes, or simply executed outright. Of the approximately 3.3 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces, over 1 million died in captivity. The lucky ones weren't released until the 1950s, returning to find their families dead and their communities destroyed. The mass rape of German women by advancing Allied forces, particularly Soviet troops, affected between 1.4 and 2 million women and girls. This wasn't spontaneous violence by individual soldiers, but systematic sexual warfare designed to humiliate and terrorize civilian populations. Many victims were raped repeatedly over periods of weeks or months, with many dying from their injuries or committing suicide. Children born from wartime rape faced lifelong discrimination and identity crises, often being rejected by their mothers' families and communities while being raised by women who had been traumatized by the circumstances of their conception. These children grew up knowing they were products of violence and were often reminded of this fact throughout their lives. Orphaned children numbered in the millions across Europe and Asia, with many having witnessed their parents' murder, been separated from families during deportations, or simply abandoned when parents died from starvation or disease. These children survived by forming gangs that lived through theft, violence, and sometimes cannibalism, creating generations of people who had never experienced normal family relationships. The psychological trauma experienced by World War II survivors was so severe that it affected their children and grandchildren through mechanisms that scientists are still studying today. Survivors suffered from what we would now recognize as complex PTSD, but in the 1940s and 1950s was dismissed as nervousness or difficulty adjusting that people were expected to overcome through willpower. Many World War II veterans never spoke about their combat experiences because what they had witnessed and participated in was so far outside normal human experience that they knew civilians couldn't understand it. Veterans who tried to explain what combat was really like were often met with disbelief, rejection, or accusations of exaggeration, leading most to remain silent about their trauma. The survivor guilt experienced by people who lived through World War II was complicated by the knowledge that their survival often came at the cost of other people's deaths. Concentration camp survivors knew that every day they stayed alive meant someone else died. Civilians who survived bombing raids had watched their neighbors burn to death while they escaped. This guilt created psychological damage that lasted for decades. Suicide rates among World War II survivors remained elevated for generations after the war ended. Many survivors who had endured years of systematic trauma finally killed themselves when they were supposedly safe and the war was over. The delayed onset of suicide among trauma survivors puzzled mental health professionals who didn't understand how wartime experiences could continue killing people decades later. The medical consequences of World War II continued killing people long after the fighting ended. Malnutrition during crucial developmental years caused permanent physical and cognitive damage that affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Diseases contracted during the war caused chronic health problems that shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life for millions of people. Tuberculosis, which had been largely controlled in many areas before the war, reached epidemic proportions in post-war Europe due to malnutrition, overcrowding, and weakened immune systems. The disease continued killing WW2 survivors for decades after the war ended, often affecting entire families who had been exposed during wartime displacement. Chemical exposure from weapons production, environmental contamination from industrial warfare, and radiation from atomic weapons created cancer clusters and genetic damage that affected multiple generations. Many areas bombed or fought over during the war remained contaminated with toxic substances that caused birth defects and health problems in children born years or decades after the fighting ended. The economic devastation caused by World War II required complete reconstruction of entire countries' industrial infrastructure, transportation systems, and urban areas. But this reconstruction was built on the backs of traumatized populations who were forced to work in dangerous conditions for minimal compensation while trying to rebuild societies that had been completely destroyed. Rationing and food shortages continued for years after the war ended in many areas, meaning that the starvation and malnutrition that characterized wartime continued to affect civilian populations long after peace was declared. Many children who survived the war continued to suffer from malnutrition-related health problems throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. The social fabric of communities that had been torn apart by war was extremely difficult to rebuild because the shared cultural institutions, religious organizations, and family structures that had held societies together had been systematically destroyed. Many communities never regained their pre-war social cohesion and cultural identity. Educational systems had to be completely reconstructed in many areas, but this reconstruction was complicated by the fact that many teachers had been killed during the war, and entire generations of children had received little or no formal education during the war years. Many children who should have been in school during the war never learned to read or write properly. The denazification process in Germany was supposed to remove Nazi influence from German society, but it was largely ineffective because so many Germans had been involved with the Nazi system in some way that removing all of them would have made it impossible for German society to function. Many former Nazis simply continued in their previous roles under new political leadership. The Nuremberg trials and other war crimes tribunals prosecuted only a tiny fraction of those who had committed atrocities during the war, partly because the scale of systematic brutality was so vast that comprehensive prosecution would have required decades and enormous resources. Most war criminals were never prosecuted and lived normal post-war lives. The Cold War that developed immediately after World War II meant that many former enemies became allies against new threats, leading to the rehabilitation of war criminals who were considered useful against communist expansion. Many people who had committed horrific atrocities during World War II were recruited by Western intelligence services or given new identities to escape prosecution. Collaboration with occupying forces during the war created lasting social divisions in many countries, as communities struggled with how to treat people who had cooperated with enemy forces. Some collaborators were executed in post-war revenge killings, while others were quietly integrated back into their communities, creating tensions that lasted for generations. The refugee resettlement process often placed traumatized populations in communities that had no understanding of what they had experienced, leading to cultural conflicts and discrimination against survivors who were trying to rebuild their lives. Many refugees were treated as burdens on their host communities, rather than as victims of unprecedented systematic violence. Language barriers complicated the trauma recovery process for millions of displaced persons who found themselves in countries where they couldn't communicate their experiences or access mental health services. Many trauma survivors lived in isolation because they couldn't express what they had been through to people who didn't speak their language. The documentation of World War II atrocities was complicated by the fact that many survivors were too traumatized to speak about their experiences, while perpetrators actively destroyed evidence of their crimes. Much of what we know about World War II atrocities comes from Nazi documentation rather than survivor testimony, because the Nazis were more willing to record their crimes than survivors were able to describe their victimization. Children who grew up in post-war families affected by World War II trauma often suffered from what psychologists now recognize as secondary trauma, transmitted from parents who had been damaged by their wartime experiences. These children grew up in households where emotional expression was suppressed, violence was normalized, and trust in authority was completely absent. The generational transmission of trauma meant that World War II affected people who were born years or decades after the war ended. Children and grandchildren of World War II survivors often suffered from anxiety, depression, and other psychological problems that could be traced to their families' wartime experiences, even when they had never been told the specific details of what their relatives had endured. Marriage and family formation among World War II survivors was complicated by the fact that many had witnessed the destruction of their own families and had difficulty trusting others or forming emotional attachments. Divorce rates were elevated among World War II survivors, and many chose not to have children because they couldn't bear the thought of bringing children into a world where such systematic brutality was possible. The artistic and cultural expressions that emerged from World War II trauma often focused on themes of meaninglessness, absurdity, and the breakdown of moral systems that had previously guided human behavior. Literature, art, and philosophy produced by World War II survivors reflected a fundamental loss of faith in human civilization and traditional values. Religious faith was severely tested by World War II experiences, with many survivors abandoning religious beliefs that couldn't explain or justify the systematic evil they had witnessed. Religious institutions that had existed for centuries were destroyed or permanently weakened by the demonstration that supposedly civilized Christian societies could implement industrial-scale murder programs. The technological and organizational capabilities that had made World War II's systematic destruction possible continued to exist after the war ended, creating the ongoing threat that similar levels of human destruction could be implemented again by any society with sufficient technical capability and bureaucratic organization. The Cold War nuclear standoff represented the logical continuation of World War II's technological approach to systematic human destruction. Scientific and medical research that had been advanced through human experimentation during World War II created ethical dilemmas that persisted for decades as researchers struggled with whether to use knowledge that had been gained through systematic torture and murder. Much of the data from Nazi and Japanese human experiments was ultimately used despite its horrific origins. The international institutions created after World War II to prevent future wars and atrocities were designed by people who had been traumatized by their experiences and often reflected the psychological damage that World War II had inflicted on entire societies. The United Nations, Geneva Conventions, and other post-war institutions were attempts to create legal frameworks that could prevent future systematic human destruction. Understanding the aftermath of World War II means recognizing that the war's impact extended far beyond the immediate death toll and physical destruction. World War II fundamentally changed human civilization by demonstrating that modern technological and organizational capabilities could be used to implement systematic evil on a scale that had never before been possible in human history, creating trauma that affected multiple generations and changed how people understood the possibilities for human behavior. The medical experiments conducted during World War II weren't crude torture sessions by sadistic individuals. They were systematic scientific research programs conducted by trained physicians using modern medical knowledge to optimize human suffering while extracting data that would advance military and racial objectives. Dr. Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz represented just one doctor among hundreds who used concentration camp prisoners as unlimited supplies of human test subjects for experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, while advancing scientific knowledge through systematic torture and murder conducted with clinical precision. Mengele's twin experiments involved sewing children together to create artificial conjoined twins, injecting chemicals directly into children's eyes to change their color, and performing surgery on conscious patients without anesthesia to observe pain responses. But these weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed experiments intended to advance Nazi theories about genetic engineering and racial superiority. The freezing experiments conducted at Dachau involved submerging prisoners in ice water until their body temperature dropped to near-death levels, then experimenting with different rewarming techniques to determine the most effective methods for treating hypothermia in German pilots shot down over cold water. Prisoners were frozen and rewarmed repeatedly until they died, with detailed medical records kept of their physiological responses throughout the process. High-altitude experiments placed prisoners in decompression chambers that simulated the conditions experienced by pilots at extreme altitudes. Prisoners were subjected to rapid decompression that caused their lungs to rupture, their blood to boil, and their organs to be crushed by changing pressure. The experiments continued until subjects died, with researchers carefully documenting the physiological processes leading to death. Malaria experiments involved deliberately infecting prisoners with malaria parasites to test potential treatments and preventive measures. Prisoners were infected with different strains of malaria, then subjected to various experimental treatments that often proved more deadly than the original disease. Many prisoners died from the experimental treatments rather than from malaria itself. Sterilization experiments were conducted to develop efficient methods for sterilizing large populations considered racially inferior. Women prisoners were sterilized through radiation exposure, surgical procedures without anesthesia, and injection of caustic substances into their reproductive organs. Many women died from infections or complications related to these procedures. The poison experiments involved testing various toxic substances on prisoners to determine lethal doses and study the effects of different poisons on human physiology. Prisoners were fed, injected, or exposed to poisons, including cyanide, strychnine, and various chemical weapons. Researchers would observe and document the dying process to gather data about how different poisons affected human beings. Bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments involved deliberately breaking prisoners' bones, severing muscles, or damaging nerves, then studying how these injuries healed under different conditions. Many prisoners had limbs broken repeatedly to study bone healing, or had muscles and nerves surgically severed to observe regeneration processes. The Japanese Unit 731 program conducted biological warfare experiments that exceeded even Nazi medical experiments in their systematic cruelty and scale. Unit 731 operated multiple facilities across occupied China, where thousands of prisoners were subjected to biological weapons testing, live vivisection, and disease experiments that killed an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 people directly. Plague experiments conducted by Unit 731 involved infecting prisoners with bubonic plague, then studying disease progression while testing various treatment methods. Prisoners were dissected while still alive and conscious to observe how plague affected internal organs. The plague bacteria developed through these experiments were then weaponized and used against Chinese civilian populations. Frostbite experiments conducted by Unit 731 involved exposing prisoners to extreme cold conditions, then testing different methods of treating frostbite. Prisoners had their limbs frozen until the tissue died, then had various treatments applied to observe healing processes. Many prisoners had limbs amputated repeatedly as part of ongoing frostbite research. Vivisection experiments involved performing surgery on conscious prisoners without anesthesia to study human anatomy and physiology. Prisoners were cut open while alive, so researchers could observe living organs, blood flow, and nervous system responses. These procedures were conducted as routine medical training for military doctors, as well as research into human physiology. Biological weapons testing involved infecting prisoners with anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases to study their effects and develop more effective biological weapons. Prisoners were exposed to disease agents through contaminated food, water, air, and direct injection. The resulting illnesses were studied in detail as prisoners died slowly from deliberately induced diseases. Chemical weapons experiments tested the effects of various poison gases and chemical agents on human subjects. Prisoners were exposed to mustard gas, cyanide, phosgene, and other chemical weapons to study their effects on human physiology and test potential protective measures and treatments. Pressure experiments involve placing prisoners in pressure chambers and subjecting them to rapid pressure changes that simulated conditions experienced by divers or aviators. These experiments often resulted in decompression sickness, organ damage, and death, as researchers studied human physiological responses to extreme pressure changes. Blood transfusion experiments involve draining blood from prisoners to study blood loss and replacement, often transfusing animal blood into human subjects to observe the results. Prisoners were used as both blood donors and recipients in experiments that often prove fatal due to blood type incompatibilities or contamination. Surgical experiments involve performing unnecessary operations on prisoners to test new surgical techniques, study human anatomy, or train military surgeons. These operations were conducted without anesthesia and often involved deliberately inflicting injuries that could then be treated experimentally. Pregnancy and childbirth experiments involved conducting obstetric procedures on pregnant prisoners, often terminating pregnancies at various stages to study fetal development. Pregnant women were subjected to experimental procedures that typically killed both mother and fetus while providing medical data about human reproduction. Pharmaceutical testing used prisoners as test subjects for experimental drugs and medical treatments. Prisoners were given untested medications, often in doses that were known to be potentially lethal, to study drug effects and toxicity levels. Many prisoners died from drug poisoning during these pharmaceutical experiments. Psychological experiments involve subjecting prisoners to various forms of mental torture and psychological manipulation to study human psychological responses to extreme stress. These experiments included sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and exposure to loud noises or bright lights for extended periods. Nutrition experiments involved deliberately starving prisoners or feeding them deficient diets to study malnutrition and test potential food supplements for military use. Prisoners were fed diets that lacked essential nutrients or were given experimental food substitutes that often proved toxic or indigestible. Pain tolerance experiments involve subjecting prisoners to various forms of physical torture while measuring their physiological and psychological responses to pain. These experiments were designed to determine human pain thresholds and study how pain affected performance and decision-making. Infectious disease experiments involve deliberately exposing prisoners to tuberculosis, typhus, hepatitis, and other diseases to study disease transmission and test potential vaccines or treatments. Prisoners were often infected with multiple diseases simultaneously to study disease interactions. Organ transplant experiments involve surgically removing organs from living prisoners and attempting to transplant them into other subjects. These procedures were conducted without proper surgical techniques or postoperative care, typically resulting in the death of both donor and recipient. Genetic experiments involved attempting to alter human genetic characteristics through radiation exposure, chemical treatment, and surgical procedures. These experiments were designed to support Nazi racial theories and develop methods for creating superior human beings while eliminating inferior genetic traits. Wound healing experiments involved deliberately inflicting injuries on prisoners, then testing various treatments and healing techniques. Prisoners had wounds created through surgery, burning, or exposure to chemicals, then had experimental treatments applied while researchers studied healing processes. The medical data gathered through these experiments was considered valuable enough that both German and Japanese researchers attempted to preserve their findings as the war ended. Much of this data was subsequently used by Allied researchers, despite its horrific origins, creating ongoing ethical dilemmas about whether knowledge gained through systematic torture should be used for legitimate medical research. Many of the doctors who conducted these experiments continued their medical careers after the war, often without prosecution for their crimes. Some were recruited by Allied intelligence services or medical research programs that valued their expertise, despite the methods they had used to acquire it. The legal and ethical frameworks that governed medical research were fundamentally changed by the revelation of World War II medical experiments, leading to the development of informed consent requirements, institutional review boards, and international medical ethics standards designed to prevent similar abuses in future medical research. The psychological impact on medical professionals who learned about these experiments was significant, forcing the medical community to confront the fact that trained physicians could systematically torture and murder patients while maintaining that they were conducting legitimate scientific research. Understanding World War II medical experiments means recognizing that they represented the systematic application of modern medical knowledge and scientific methodology to optimize human suffering while gathering data that advanced military and ideological objectives. These weren't crude torture sessions, but sophisticated research programs that used victims' suffering to advance scientific knowledge through methods that violated fundamental principles of human dignity and medical ethics. Childhood during World War II didn't exist. Children were transformed into miniature adults who witnessed, participated in, and became victims of systematic violence that destroyed their capacity for normal emotional development, while forcing them to make survival choices that would psychologically damage them for the rest of their lives. You're 8 years old in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, and you haven't eaten a full meal in over a year. Your daily job is to smuggle food through holes in the ghetto wall, risking being shot by German guards or beaten by Polish civilians who catch you. You've watched your younger sister die from starvation, your parents are slowly dying from typhus, and you know that survival depends on your ability to steal food while avoiding the Nazis, who are systematically murdering everyone in your community. Child mortality during World War II reached levels that eliminated entire generations in many areas. In some occupied territories, over 50% of children died from starvation, disease, violence, or deliberate murder. These weren't accidental casualties, but systematic targeting of children as a method of eliminating future generations of undesirable populations. The Kinder Transport program that evacuated Jewish children from Nazi Germany saved approximately 10,000 children, but it also permanently separated them from their families, most of whom were subsequently murdered in concentration camps. These children survived physically, but grew up as orphans in foreign countries, never knowing what happened to their parents and siblings. Children in concentration camps faced specialized forms of torture designed specifically for their age and developmental stage. Dr. Mengelé's experiments on twins at Auschwitz included injecting chemicals into children's eyes, sewing children together to create artificial conjoined twins, and performing surgery without anesthesia while children were conscious and aware. The selection process at concentration camps sent children under 14 directly to gas chambers because they were considered economically useless and racially dangerous. Children who lied about their age to avoid immediate murder were worked to death in conditions that their developing bodies couldn't survive. Child labor in Nazi concentration camps and Japanese-occupied territories involved forcing children as young as 6 to work 12 to 16-hour days in dangerous conditions that killed them through exhaustion, industrial accidents, and malnutrition. Children were preferred for certain types of work because their small size allowed them to crawl into machinery or tight spaces that adults couldn't access. The Hitler Youth Program militarized German children by training them to kill and die for Nazi ideology. Children as young as 10 were given military training, taught to use weapons, and indoctrinated to view violence and death as glorious sacrifices for the Nazi state. By the end of the war, children were being used as soldiers in combat operations. Soviet child soldiers were used extensively on the Eastern Front, with children as young as 12 serving as snipers, reconnaissance troops, and suicide bombers. These children were often orphans who had no other means of survival, but they were systematically trained to kill and often died in combat operations designed specifically to use their expendability. Japanese military training programs in occupied territories forced children to participate in military exercises that included killing prisoners, practicing with weapons, and learning combat techniques. Children who showed reluctance to participate in violence were beaten or killed as examples to other children. The evacuation of children from bombed cities often became death marches, where children died from starvation, exposure, and disease, while being moved away from advancing enemy forces. Many children were separated from their families during these evacuations and never reunited, growing up as orphans in unfamiliar areas. Child refugees numbered in the millions across Europe and Asia, with many having witnessed their parents' murder, been separated from families during deportations, or simply abandoned when parents died from starvation or disease. These children survived by forming gangs that operated like small armies, fighting other children for food and shelter. Street children in bombed cities lived in the ruins of destroyed buildings, surviving by scavenging food from corpses, stealing from other survivors, and sometimes engaging in cannibalism when no other food was available. Many of these children never learned to read or write because schools had been destroyed and no adults were available to care for them. Sexual abuse of children was systematic during World War II, with occupying forces using child prostitution as both entertainment and weapon of war. Children were forced into sexual slavery, raped by soldiers, and used in pornographic materials produced for military personnel. Many children died from injuries related to sexual abuse or committed suicide to escape continued victimization. Child informants were used by all sides in the conflict, with children being trained to spy on their own families, neighbors, and communities. Children who refused to inform on resistance activities were tortured or killed, while those who cooperated with occupying forces were often murdered by resistance fighters as traitors. Medical experiments on children were considered especially valuable because their developing bodies were thought to provide cleaner research data than adult subjects. Children were deliberately infected with diseases, subjected to surgical procedures without anesthesia, and used as test subjects for experimental drugs and treatments. Forced sterilization of children was implemented as part of Nazi racial policies designed to prevent future reproduction by racially inferior populations. Children were sterilized through radiation exposure, surgery, and injection of caustic chemicals that often killed them or caused lifelong health problems. Child sacrifice in religious and pseudoscientific rituals became common in some areas as desperate populations turned to extreme measures in attempts to appease whatever forces they believed were responsible for their suffering. Children were killed in ritual ceremonies that combined traditional beliefs with wartime desperation. The psychological impact on children who witnessed mass killings, rape, torture, and systematic brutality was so severe that many never developed normal emotional responses or social skills. Children who survived World War II often suffered from severe anxiety, depression, and inability to form trusting relationships throughout their adult lives. Educational deprivation affected entire generations of children who should have been in school during the war years, but instead experienced years of violence, displacement, and survival struggle. Many children never learned basic literacy and numeracy skills, limiting their opportunities for the rest of their lives. Child marriage increased dramatically during World War II as families desperate for survival married off young daughters to obtain food, protection, or economic support. Girls as young as 10 were married to adult men in arrangements that amounted to legalized rape and sexual slavery. Pregnancy among teenage girls increased due to widespread rape and sexual abuse, with many young girls dying in childbirth because their bodies weren't mature enough to safely deliver babies. Those who survived often suffered from physical damage that affected them for the rest of their lives. Child soldiers were used extensively by all armies involved in World War II, not just as support personnel, but as active combatants who were expected to kill and die in military operations. Children were considered expendable resources who could be sacrificed to achieve military objectives without significant cost to adult populations. The indoctrination of children into systematic violence was so thorough that many children became enthusiastic participants in torture, murder, and other atrocities. Children learned to view extreme violence as normal and necessary, developing psychological patterns that made them dangerous to themselves and others throughout their lives. Orphanages during World War II often became death camps where abandoned children died from starvation, disease, and neglect. Many orphanages were deliberately understaffed and undersupplied, leading to mortality rates that exceeded 75% among children placed in institutional care. Foster care systems broke down completely in many areas, leaving orphaned children to fend for themselves without any adult protection or guidance. These children often died within weeks or months of being left alone, or survived by engaging in criminal activities that further damaged their psychological development. Religious institutions that had traditionally cared for orphaned and abandoned children were often destroyed or converted to military use, eliminating traditional safety nets that had protected vulnerable children during previous conflicts. Children who might have been cared for by religious organizations were instead left to die or survive through their own efforts. Child mortality from preventable diseases reached epidemic proportions as medical care was diverted to military use and public health systems collapsed. Children died from diseases like measles, diphtheria, and whooping cough that could have been easily prevented or treated under normal circumstances. Malnutrition among children was so severe that it caused permanent developmental damage, including stunted growth, cognitive impairment, and reproductive problems that affected them throughout their adult lives. Children who survived severe malnutrition often suffered from learning disabilities and behavioral problems that made normal social integration impossible. Child labor exploitation included forcing children to work in weapons factories, construction projects, and agricultural operations under conditions that killed them through industrial accidents, poisoning, and exhaustion. Children were preferred for dangerous work because they could be paid less than adults and were considered more expendable. Family separation affected millions of children who were deliberately separated from their parents through deportation, forced labor recruitment, and systematic family destruction policies. Many children never saw their parents again and grew up not knowing their family history or cultural background. Cultural destruction policies specifically targeted children for re-education programs designed to eliminate their ethnic, religious, and cultural identities. Children were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their religions, or maintain their cultural traditions, creating generations of people who had been cut off from their historical roots. Child trafficking increased dramatically during World War II as criminal organizations exploited the chaos and displacement to kidnap children for sexual slavery, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation. Many children were sold by desperate parents who couldn't feed them, or kidnapped from refugee camps and displacement centers. Psychological warfare tactics specifically targeted children as a method of breaking adult resistance. Occupying forces would torture and murder children in front of their parents to force cooperation or threaten harm to children to obtain intelligence or compliance from adult populations. Child witnesses to atrocities were often killed to eliminate testimony about war crimes, or were so psychologically damaged by what they had seen that they couldn't provide coherent accounts of events. Many children who witnessed systematic murder and torture developed selective amnesia as a psychological defense mechanism. The recovery process for child survivors of World War II was complicated by the fact that many had no family members left alive to care for them, no communities to return to, and no cultural institutions that could help them process their traumatic experiences. Many child survivors never fully recovered from their wartime experiences and struggled with mental health problems throughout their lives. Educational rehabilitation for child survivors was extremely difficult because many had missed years of schooling and had been traumatized in ways that made normal learning environments impossible. Special educational programs had to be developed to help child survivors catch up academically while addressing their psychological trauma. Adoption of war orphans was complicated by the fact that many children had been so traumatized that they couldn't form normal attachment relationships with adoptive families. Many adoptions failed because child survivors had learned survival behaviors that made them unsuitable for normal family life. Identity confusion affected many child survivors who had been too young to remember their original families or cultural backgrounds, but were old enough to know they had been displaced and traumatized. These children often struggled with questions about their origins and belonging throughout their adult lives. Long-term health consequences for child survivors included growth and developmental problems caused by malnutrition, psychological disorders from trauma exposure, and chronic health conditions related to disease and injury during the war years. Many child survivors died prematurely as adults from health problems that originated during their wartime experiences. Understanding the impact of World War II on children means recognizing that the war eliminated childhood as a protected developmental phase for millions of young people, forcing them to experience adult-level trauma and responsibility at ages when they should have been learning basic social and emotional skills. The psychological and developmental damage done to these children affected not only their own lives, but the lives of their children and grandchildren, creating generational cycles of trauma that persisted long after the war ended. Women during World War II faced systematic sexual violence, forced labor, and deliberate targeting that turned gender into a vulnerability that could mean the difference between life and death, with rape being used as a weapon of war that affected millions of women across every theater of conflict, while being largely ignored in post-war histories. The mass rape of women during World War II wasn't spontaneous violence by individual soldiers, but systematic sexual warfare implemented as deliberate military policy designed to terrorize civilian populations, break family structures, and humiliate enemy communities through the violation of their women and girls. Soviet forces advancing through Eastern Europe raped an estimated 1.4 to 2 million German women and girls during the final stages of the war. This wasn't random violence, but systematic revenge conducted as official policy, with Soviet commanders encouraging or ordering the rape of German civilians as punishment for German war crimes and as a method of terrorizing the German population into submission. The rape of Berlin involved systematic sexual assault of women and girls from age 8 to 80, often conducted in front of family members as psychological warfare designed to break German civilian morale. Many women were raped repeatedly over periods of weeks or months, with some dying from their injuries and others committing suicide rather than face continued sexual violence. Japanese military sexual slavery through the comfort women system forced between 200,000 and 400,000 women and girls into prostitution for Japanese military personnel. These women were kidnapped from occupied territories, deceived with promises of employment, or sold by desperate families, then forced to service 20 to 40 soldiers per day in conditions that amounted to systematic rape and torture. Comfort stations were essentially rape camps, where women were held as sexual slaves under conditions that guaranteed their eventual death from disease, physical abuse, or murder. Women who became pregnant were often killed or forced to have abortions. Those who became ill were abandoned to die without medical care. Many women were murdered when Japanese forces retreated to prevent them from testifying about their treatment. The systematic rape of Chinese women during the Rape of Nanking involved Japanese soldiers gang raping women and girls before murdering them, often in front of their families. Women were raped with bayonets, bottles, and other objects that caused fatal injuries. Pregnant women were cut open and their fetuses removed and killed. The sexual violence was designed to maximize terror and humiliation rather than just physical domination. German military brothels in occupied territories used forced prostitution as both a reward system for troops and a method of controlling local populations. Women were conscripted into sexual slavery through roundups, kidnapping, and economic coercion. These military brothels operated as systematic rape facilities where women were sexually abused until they died from disease, violence, or suicide. Concentration camp brothels used female prisoners as sexual slaves for camp guards and privileged prisoners. Women were forced into prostitution through threats of death, promises of better treatment, or simply direct coercion. These women faced the additional horror of being sexually abused while already suffering from starvation, disease, and systematic dehumanization. Sexual violence and partisan warfare involved rape being used by all sides as a method of terrorizing civilian populations and punishing communities suspected of supporting enemy forces. Women in occupied territories faced rape from occupying forces, collaborators, and sometimes resistance fighters who used sexual violence as a method of enforcing cooperation or extracting information. Medical experiments on women included forced sterilization through radiation, surgery, and injection of caustic chemicals into reproductive organs. Women were subjected to gynecological experiments without anesthesia, had their ovaries removed for research purposes, and were used as test subjects for experimental contraceptives and fertility treatments that often proved fatal. Pregnancy during World War II was often a death sentence due to malnutrition, lack of medical care, and deliberate targeting of pregnant women by enemy forces. Maternal mortality rates exceeded 15% in many areas, with women dying from complications that would have been easily treatable under normal circumstances. Forced labor exploitation of women included working in weapons factories under conditions that poisoned them with toxic chemicals, construction projects that killed them through industrial accidents, and agricultural work that exhausted them to death. Women were often paid less than men while performing the same dangerous work, and pregnant women were forced to work until they gave birth or died from exhaustion. Women in siege warfare faced specialized horrors, including being forced to choose between watching their children starve or prostituting themselves for food. During the siege of Leningrad, women traded sexual services for bread rations, often dying from sexually transmitted diseases or violence from customers who refused to pay. Trafficking of women for sexual slavery increased dramatically during World War II as criminal organizations exploited the chaos and displacement to kidnap women for prostitution. Many women were transported across international borders and forced to work in brothels, serving military personnel with no possibility of escape or rescue. Women refugees faced systematic sexual abuse during transportation and in refugee camps, where guards and other refugees often demanded sexual services in exchange for food, shelter, or protection. Many women died from injuries sustained during rape or from diseases contracted through forced prostitution. Female resistance fighters faced specialized torture designed specifically for their gender, including rape, sexual mutilation, and threats against their children. Women who were captured by enemy forces were often sexually tortured for information about resistance activities, then murdered after being repeatedly raped. War widows faced economic desperation that often forced them into prostitution as the only means of supporting themselves and their children. The death of male family members left many women without any legal means of economic support, making them vulnerable to sexual exploitation and trafficking. Child marriage increased dramatically during World War II as families used their daughters as economic assets, marrying them to older men in exchange for food, protection, or money. Girls as young as 12 were married to adult men in arrangements that amounted to legalized rape and sexual slavery, disguised as traditional marriage customs. Industrial sexual exploitation involved forcing women to work in brothels that served workers in weapons factories, construction projects, and other military-related industries. These brothels were often located within factory complexes, making them essentially sex slavery operations disguised as entertainment facilities for workers. Nursing and medical personnel who were women faced sexual assault from patients, colleagues, and military personnel they were treating. Female medical workers were often raped by wounded soldiers they were caring for, with these attacks being ignored or covered up by military authorities who considered sexual assault an inevitable part of wartime medical care. Female prisoners of war faced systematic rape and sexual abuse in violation of all international laws governing the treatment of captured military personnel. Women who served in combat roles or auxiliary military positions were often sexually tortured when captured, with their military status providing no protection from sexual violence. Domestic violence increased dramatically during World War II as men traumatized by combat returned home and took out their psychological damage on their wives and daughters. Many women who survived wartime sexual violence were then subjected to additional abuse from husbands and family members who blamed them for their victimization. Forced marriage to enemy soldiers was used as a method of humiliating conquered populations while providing sexual services to occupying forces. Women were forced to marry soldiers from occupying armies, often after their husbands had been killed in military operations or executed as resistance fighters. Sexual blackmail was used systematically to force women to cooperate with occupying forces, provide intelligence about resistance activities, or participate in other forms of collaboration. Women were threatened with rape or murder of their children unless they provided sexual services or assisted enemy operations. Pornographic exploitation involved forcing women to participate in sexual photography and films that were produced for military personnel. Women were coerced into pornographic activities through threats of violence, promises of better treatment, or simply direct force, with the resulting materials being distributed to boost military morale. Strip searches and sexual humiliation were used routinely during arrests, deportations, and processing of civilian populations. Women were forced to undress in front of male soldiers and guards, subjected to invasive body searches, and sexually humiliated as a method of breaking their psychological resistance. Forced nudity in concentration camps and prisoner facilities was used as a method of dehumanizing women while facilitating sexual abuse by guards and other personnel. Women were kept naked or partially clothed in conditions that made them vulnerable to sexual assault while destroying their sense of human dignity. Reproductive coercion included forcing women to have children to increase population of desirable racial groups, or preventing reproduction through sterilization, abortion, and murder of pregnant women from undesirable populations. Women's reproductive capacity was treated as a resource to be controlled by occupying forces rather than a personal choice. Sexual torture techniques specifically designed for women included rape with foreign objects, electrical shock applied to genitals, and sexual mutilation that often proved fatal. These torture methods were used to extract information, terrorize communities, and satisfy the sadistic impulses of perpetrators who used wartime conditions to indulge in extreme sexual violence. Economic sexual exploitation forced women to trade sexual services for basic necessities, including food, shelter, medical care, and protection for their children. The collapse of normal economic systems meant that many women had no resources except their bodies, which they were forced to sell to survive or to keep their families alive. Cultural destruction through sexual violence included deliberate rape of women from specific ethnic or religious groups as a method of contaminating bloodlines and destroying cultural identity. Rape was used as a weapon of genocide, designed to eliminate cultural groups through forced pregnancy and destruction of traditional family structures. Post-war stigmatization of rape victims meant that women who survived sexual violence during the war often faced rejection from their own communities and families. Many rape survivors were blamed for their victimization, considered damaged goods, and ostracized from their communities, forcing them to live as social outcasts for the rest of their lives. Venereal disease transmission through systematic rape caused widespread health problems among women who survived sexual violence. Many women died from sexually transmitted diseases contracted during wartime rape, while others suffered from chronic health problems that affected them for the rest of their lives. Psychological trauma from systematic sexual violence created lasting mental health problems, including severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder that affected women for decades after the war ended. Many women who survived wartime sexual violence never recovered psychologically and struggled with mental illness throughout their adult lives. Legal invisibility of wartime sexual violence meant that most rape perpetrators were never prosecuted for their crimes, and rape victims received no compensation or recognition for their suffering. The systematic sexual violence against women during World War II was largely ignored in post-war justice proceedings, with rape being considered an inevitable byproduct of warfare rather than a war crime. Intergenerational transmission of trauma affected the children of women who had been sexually assaulted during the war, with many children growing up in households where mothers were psychologically damaged by their wartime experiences. These children often suffered from secondary trauma and behavioral problems related to their mother's untreated psychological injuries. Social silence about wartime sexual violence meant that most women who survived rape and sexual abuse during World War II never spoke about their experiences, even to their own families. This silence prevented healing and perpetuated the psychological damage caused by sexual violence, while allowing society to ignore the scope and impact of systematic sexual warfare. Medical consequences of wartime sexual violence included reproductive health problems, chronic pain, and disability that affected women for the rest of their lives. Many women who survived systematic rape suffered from internal injuries, scarring, and gynecological problems that made normal sexual relationships and childbearing difficult or impossible. Understanding the systematic sexual violence against women during World War II means recognizing that rape and sexual exploitation were deliberate weapons of war used by all sides in the conflict to terrorize civilian populations, break family structures, and humiliate enemy communities. The scale and systematic nature of sexual violence during World War II represented one of the largest campaigns of sexual warfare in human history, affecting millions of women whose suffering was largely ignored in post-war histories that focused on military operations rather than civilian victimization. The most terrifying aspect of World War II wasn't that evil monsters committed unprecedented atrocities. It was that ordinary people, normal citizens with families and jobs, were systematically transformed into enthusiastic participants in genocide, torture, and mass murder through bureaucratic processes that made systematic evil seem like routine administrative work. You're a middle-aged German accountant in 1942, and your job is calculating the most cost-effective methods for transporting Jews to extermination camps. You work in a clean office, use modern business efficiency methods, and take pride in reducing per-person transportation costs through optimization of train car capacity and route planning. You never see the people being murdered, but your spreadsheets ensure that genocide operates with maximum efficiency and minimum expense. The Holocaust wasn't implemented by SS fanatics alone. It required the active participation of hundreds of thousands of ordinary Germans, including teachers, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, business managers, and skilled workers who carried out mass murder through normal bureaucratic processes that made genocide seem like legitimate government policy. Local police units throughout occupied Europe were transformed into killing squads that murdered millions of civilians through door-to-door executions, mass shooting operations, and deportation programs that sent entire communities to extermination camps. These weren't specially trained killers, but regular policemen who had been gradually conditioned to view certain populations as legitimate targets for systematic elimination. Reserve Police Battalion 101, composed of middle-aged German reservists with no special ideological training, murdered over 38,000 Polish Jews in less than 2 years through mass shooting operations that required face-to-face killing of women, children, and elderly civilians. These men initially showed reluctance to participate in mass murder, but were gradually conditioned through peer pressure and bureaucratic normalization to become efficient killers. The Einsatzgruppen death squads that murdered over 1 million Jews in Eastern Europe were staffed largely by educated professionals, including lawyers, teachers, and university graduates who used their organizational skills to plan and implement systematic mass murder operations. These educated men applied modern management techniques to optimize killing efficiency while maintaining detailed records of their genocidal activities. Ukrainian auxiliary police units recruited from local populations participated enthusiastically in Holocaust operations, often showing more brutality than German forces in their treatment of Jewish populations. These local collaborators knew their victims personally, former neighbors, classmates, and business associates, but participated willingly in their systematic murder. Lithuanian and Latvian auxiliaries conducted some of the most brutal Holocaust operations in Eastern Europe, using particularly cruel methods to torture and kill Jewish civilians. These Baltic collaborators often exceeded German expectations for brutality, inventing creative torture techniques and competing to see who could kill the most Jews in single operations. French police and civil servants actively participated in Holocaust deportations, conducting roundups of Jewish families, managing detention camps, and facilitating transportation to extermination camps. French officials often exceeded German requirements, deporting more Jews than requested and providing more efficient bureaucratic support than Nazi administrators had expected. Dutch civil servants created the most comprehensive registration system for Jewish persecution in occupied Europe, providing detailed records that enabled efficient identification and deportation of Jewish populations. Dutch bureaucrats took professional pride in their administrative efficiency, not recognizing that their meticulous record-keeping was facilitating systematic murder. Hungarian authorities implemented some of the most rapid and efficient Holocaust operations, deporting over 400,000 Jews to Auschwitz in just 2 months during 1944. Hungarian police, civil servants, and railway personnel worked around the clock to achieve deportation quotas that exceeded German expectations for speed and efficiency. Croatian Ustasha forces implemented genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Roma with such extreme brutality that even German allies were shocked by their methods. Ordinary Croatian civilians participated in mass killings using farming tools, household implements, and improvised weapons to torture and murder their former neighbors. Romanian military and police forces conducted systematic massacres of Jews and Roma that killed over 280,000 people through mass shootings, deportations to death camps, and deliberate starvation policies. Romanian soldiers and civilians competed to see who could devise the most creative methods for torturing and killing civilians. Slovak authorities voluntarily paid Germany for each Jew deported to extermination camps, treating Holocaust participation as a profitable business arrangement. Slovak officials negotiated deportation quotas like commercial contracts, haggling over prices and delivery schedules for human beings they were sending to their deaths. Japanese Unit 731 biological warfare operations were staffed by university-educated scientists, medical doctors, and technicians who conducted systematic human experimentation and biological weapons development using scientific methodology to optimize torture and murder. These educated professionals published research papers based on data gathered through systematic torture of prisoners. Japanese military personnel throughout occupied Asia participated enthusiastically in systematic atrocities, including mass rape, biological warfare, and human experimentation. Ordinary soldiers competed to see who could kill the most civilians, bayonet the most children, or rape the most women during systematic massacres of civilian populations. Chinese collaborators with Japanese forces participated in biological warfare operations, systematic torture of resistance fighters, and implementation of forced labor programs that killed millions of Chinese civilians. These collaborators often showed more brutality than Japanese forces in their treatment of their own countrymen. Soviet NKVD personnel, many of whom were ordinary workers and peasants before joining state security services, implemented systematic deportation and execution programs that killed millions of Soviet citizens. These agents conducted door-to-door arrests, managed forced labor camps, and carried out mass executions of people classified as enemies of the state. Local administrators throughout the Soviet Union participated in collectivization policies that deliberately starved millions of Ukrainian and Kazakh peasants to death. Soviet officials confiscated all food supplies, blocked relief efforts, and prevented migration that might have allowed people to escape systematic starvation. Polish Blue Police, recruited from local populations, participated in Holocaust operations, ghetto liquidations, and anti-partisan warfare that killed hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews and resistance fighters. These Polish collaborators often knew their victims personally, but participated willingly in their systematic murder for economic benefits and career advancement. Italian authorities in occupied Yugoslavia implemented brutal counterinsurgency operations that included systematic massacre of civilian populations, deportation to concentration camps, and use of poison gas against resistance fighters. Italian soldiers and administrators participated enthusiastically in atrocities that violated all international laws of warfare. Finnish authorities cooperated with German Holocaust operations by deporting Jewish refugees to Nazi concentration camps, implementing anti-Semitic legislation, and providing intelligence support for German atrocity operations. Finnish officials treated Holocaust participation as a normal diplomatic obligation to their German allies. Bulgarian authorities implemented comprehensive anti-Jewish legislation and deportation programs while protecting Bulgarian Jewish citizens, demonstrating that Holocaust participation was a conscious policy choice rather than an inevitable result of German pressure. Bulgarian officials made calculated decisions about which populations to sacrifice to maintain political relationships. Norwegian police and civil servants actively participated in Holocaust deportations, resistance suppression, and implementation of Nazi racial policies. Norwegian Quisling government officials often exceeded German expectations for collaboration, volunteering to implement anti-Jewish measures that Germans hadn't specifically requested. Belgian authorities facilitated Holocaust deportations through efficient railway administration, police cooperation, and civil service support that enabled rapid deportation of Belgian Jewish populations. Belgian officials treated Holocaust logistics as routine administrative work, requiring professional competence and bureaucratic efficiency. Corporate participation in systematic atrocities included German businesses that used slave labor, built extermination facilities, and provided logistical support for genocidal operations. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Volkswagen incorporated systematic murder into their business models, treating human lives as expendable production inputs. Banking institutions throughout occupied Europe facilitated Holocaust operations by confiscating Jewish assets, managing stolen wealth, and providing financial services for genocidal operations. Banks treated systematic theft and murder as profitable business opportunities requiring professional financial management. Medical professionals throughout Nazi-occupied Europe participated enthusiastically in euthanasia programs, human experimentation, and systematic murder of disabled patients. Doctors and nurses who had taken oaths to preserve life became efficient killers who used medical knowledge to optimize suffering and death. Educational institutions transformed teachers and students into agents of systematic indoctrination and violence. Teachers implemented curricula designed to promote hatred and dehumanization, while students were trained to inform on their families and participate in systematic persecution of targeted populations. Religious institutions often provided moral justification for systematic atrocities, with clergy members blessing genocidal operations, providing theological support for mass murder, and actively participating in persecution of targeted religious minorities. Church authorities treated systematic evil as divinely sanctioned policy, requiring faithful implementation. Legal professionals transformed judicial systems into mechanisms for legitimizing systematic murder through creation of pseudo-legal frameworks that made genocide appear to be legitimate government policy. Lawyers, judges, and legal scholars used their expertise to provide legal justification for unprecedented atrocities. Scientific institutions redirected research toward developing more efficient methods for systematic killing through weapons development, biological warfare research, and human experimentation programs. Scientists applied rigorous methodology to optimize human suffering while advancing their academic careers through systematic torture and murder. Media organizations transformed journalism into propaganda that promoted systematic hatred while normalizing unprecedented atrocities through routine reporting that made genocide seem like ordinary news. Journalists and editors used their communication skills to facilitate systematic evil through manipulation of public opinion. Transportation workers, including railway personnel, truck drivers, and shipping employees, facilitated systematic deportation and murder through efficient logistics that enabled rapid movement of victims to extermination sites. These workers treated human cargo like any other freight, requiring professional transportation services. The gradual conditioning process that transformed ordinary people into systematic killers involved incremental increases in violence that slowly desensitized participants to atrocity while providing social and economic incentives for participation in systematic evil. People who initially showed reluctance to participate in violence were gradually conditioned through peer pressure, bureaucratic normalization, and material rewards. Bureaucratic language was used to disguise systematic murder through euphemisms that made genocide sound like administrative policy requiring professional implementation. Terms like resettlement, special treatment, and final solution allowed participants to maintain psychological distance from the reality that they were implementing systematic human destruction. Career advancement within genocidal systems rewarded efficiency in implementing systematic murder while punishing reluctance to participate in atrocities. Ambitious individuals discovered that promotion and professional success required enthusiasm for systematic killing, creating incentive structures that encouraged participation in unprecedented evil. Social conformity pressures within genocidal systems made non-participation in systematic murder socially unacceptable while celebrating efficient killers as model citizens deserving community respect. People who refused to participate in atrocities faced social isolation and economic punishment, while enthusiastic participants received social recognition and material rewards. Economic incentives for participation in systematic murder included access to stolen property, guaranteed employment, and financial compensation for participation in genocidal operations. Many ordinary people discovered that systematic evil was more profitable than legitimate work, creating economic motivations for enthusiastic participation in unprecedented atrocities. Psychological adaptation to systematic evil involved defense mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to participate in genocide while maintaining their self-image as decent human beings. Participants convinced themselves that they were following orders, protecting their families, or serving higher purposes that justified their participation in systematic murder. The normalization of systematic evil within genocidal societies made atrocity participation seem like routine civic duty rather than unprecedented moral evil. Communities adapted to systematic murder by treating it as normal government policy, requiring citizen cooperation and professional implementation. Understanding how ordinary people became systematic killers during World War II reveals that genocidal societies don't require evil populations, but can transform normal people into enthusiastic participants in unprecedented atrocities through bureaucratic processes, social pressures, and incentive structures that make systematic evil seem like legitimate professional work, deserving social recognition and material reward.